Hello, fellow Americans. I'm here to talk about part 2 of the chapter 8 reading notes. Part 2 portion is definitely more difficult than the part 1 portion because it has 6 boxes instead of 4. So we're going to get going and we're going to recap a little bit from the last set of notes where the big argument was between the large states and the small states. The large states wanted population to count towards their number of votes in the government, and the small states wanted the number of votes to be equal. Once they resolved this with the Great Compromise, having the House of Representatives and the Senate, now they came upon another problem. How should the slaves be counted for representation? Like the South, for instance, wanted to count the slaves as people when it came to representation, but didn't want to give them any rights. Well, at the same time, the North said, well, these slaves you count as property, you can't possibly count them as people. So a huge argument ensued as to how the slaves would be counted toward population. And so the South was trying to get away with counting them as people while not treating them as people, and the North didn't want them to be counted because the more slaves that were counted, the more votes the South had, and the more votes the South had, the stronger slavery would become. So what ended up happening, and this is a really sad portion of American history, is instead of ending slavery and doing what was right, they made a compromise. And what they compromised was that 3/5 of the slaves would be counted as people, and 2/5 of the slaves wouldn't be counted at all. And this is called the 3/5 compromise. So this answers box 8.7, the issue at how slaves should be counted, and 8.8, the 3/5 compromise. The argument is the North had the view that if the slaves had no rights, they shouldn't be counted towards population, and the South had this view of, well, they're people down here, so we're going to count them. And so in the end, they came up with this 3/5 compromise that really goes down in history as like one of the most awful things. I mean, this was written into our Constitution. So this is really kind of a pretty shaky aspect of the Constitutional Convention. Issue 9 is how should the chief executive be elected? Why didn't the delegates agree on how a national executive should be chosen? Now, this goes back to the Virginia plan that had 3 houses of government. And in the Virginia plan, it called for an executive. And the executive's job is not to make laws, but to enforce the law and make sure the laws are being followed. Now, they had a lot of disagreements as to how they should do this. Many people thought Congress makes the law, so Congress should elect the person to enforce the law. But there were people who disagreed with that, saying that this person would just become like the king of the Congress and that he would have too much power. Other people thought that the people should elect the executive, and you should know that the executive is the president. And the executive still to this day is not directly elected by the people. A lot of people were afraid that, the state that had the most people would always elect the president. So there was a lot of arguments over how the executive was going to be elected. What they ended up doing in 8.10 was they came up with the Electoral College. And the executive would be elected by a special body called the Electoral College, and delegates from the Electoral College would be chosen by the states. So the states essentially elect the president, and I'm going to talk more about this in class, but what you really need to know is that a compromise was reached on the executive, just like the compromise on the slaves, and just like the compromise on representation in Congress. So they made a compromise that the states would elect the president or the executive. Okay, the convention ends, and there's the famous quote by Ben Franklin, whether or not the sun on Washington's chair was setting and rising. So they put the Constitution to the states to see if it would get ratified, and ratified means approved, and it needed to get approved by 9 states. And so many people were afraid that this government was going to be too strong, and it took a little while to ratify the Constitution. going on to the last box, which is 8.12, the Constitution goes to the nation. One of the things that helped the Constitution be ratified by the states, one of the things that helped was the Federalist Papers, which were a series of persuasive essays written by John Jay and Alexander Hamilton and James Madison that explained why the Constitution would be good. So these Federalist Papers were persuasive essays, and they got in the newspaper, and people read them and eventually voted for the Constitution. The people who were against the Constitution still feared that the Constitution had too much power, that the government was going to be too strong, and they were known as the Anti-Federalists. So you have the Federalists who wanted the Constitution, and they wrote the Federalist Papers, which were persuasive essays. And then they also had the Anti-Federalists, who were people who were against the Constitution. So I've answered the questions 8.7, 8.8, 8.9, 8.10, and 8.11, and 8.12. So if you need further help, contact me on Edmodo. This is number 2 of this series, helping you with your reading notes. Please contact me on Edmodo if you need help. This assignment is due Tuesday, October 27th. God bless you, and God bless America.